As gunfire and protests continue across the streets of Iran, the anti-hijab protests are being seen as the most serious challenge to the Iranian authorities in decades. The protests were prompted by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in police custody. Amini was reportedly beaten up by Iran's so-called morality police for not wearing a hijab properly. She died in a hospital 3 days later, according to Iran's human rights group. More than 200 people, including 23 children, have died so far in the protests. However, the government has denied killing any protesters, even as people upload videos of police firing on the streets. To take this forward, I'm now joined by Kamin Mohammadi, writer and journalist, and Persis Karim, chair and director at Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, joining us from San Francisco. Persis Karim, I'd like to ask you about these protests. Do you think, and we've widely read that these are unprecedented, there have been protests over the last 2 decades, nothing of this kind. Will this force a regime, changes in the Iranian regime and their approach to women's rights?
Well, I think one of the things that we don't know is where this is going. And part of it is that this is a unique moment in the history of the world to see this many people out on the streets and to not have a leader that is identifiable. It's a spontaneous effort on behalf of the people of Iran. And I want to point out that it's also the Kurdish people who have paid a very high price inside of Iran. The thing that makes this a very unique protest is that it's led largely by women. Men have joined in, of course, but it was started by the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. And in a way, her death is the spark for many other grievances against the Islamic Republic. And I think what's important to point out is that this is one of many protests that have occurred over the last 20 years, as you point out. But there have been many attempts to reform the laws, especially the discriminatory laws against women, over the years, and that failed. And many people feel that voting failed, that there has been little opportunity for Iranians to address their frustration. And then, of course, the economic situation in Iran as a result of sanctions, COVID, is another sort of fuel for what's happening on the streets. So I think while it's fundamentally about discrimination and what we call gender apartheid in Iran, there are many more people joining in because they see the regime as failing to address the people's needs, and also the absolute frustration with the repression that has occurred over and over again over the last 40 years. Any dissent is not tolerated. And of course, these protests were met with violence in 2019, in 2009. So it's not unique that they're meting out particular violence towards these protesters. What's unique is that people are resisting in an unprecedented scale.
Okay. Absolutely. We have been seeing that happen, not just in Iran, across the world as well. Kamin Mohammadi, if I can get you in at this stage, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has blamed US and Israel for orchestrating these protests. He's made it clear that these protests will be dealt with severely. Do you think the Iranian leadership this time will be able to control these protests with a heavy hand?
That's a good question. I think that they will try, and I think that what we have ahead of us is grim, because historically you can see that the Iranian regime hasn't been particularly shy about turning its brute force onto protesters. And the Green Wave movement of 2009, which was organized, which did have leadership, all the things that, as Persis said, doesn't seem to exist with this this particular set of protests. It took them 7 months to really effectively quash that movement. It wasn't just about the arrests and the killing in the moment. That was an operation, where they swept through anybody who had any connections, any links. So can they do it? they have the ability, I assume. But what is unique about these protests is that in spite of this, people are not going home. And I think what we're hearing is that the security forces are getting very exhausted. They're getting tired. You know, this has been going on for a month now. We're seeing anecdotally also some members of the police joining the protesters. We're hearing also that they don't necessarily want to turn this sort of violence and brute force against their own people. So certainly they can, whether they will. Of course, this regime has not ever really dealt with dissent in any way other than to kill, jail, and goodness knows what else. I mean, we've heard that a lot of the young people, the young girls who are being taken, and the average age, I want to say this, of those being arrested is 15. They're taking them to, you know, mental institutions for re-education. So it's very dark outlook.
Right. Of course, a very dark outlook there. Persis, Karim, just to bring you in once again, do you think the sanctions, the international pressure at this stage is going to work on the Iranian regime? Or do you think if any change can be brought out, it can only be brought out by the Iranian women right now?
Well, we know that the sanctions are part of what has brought people to this moment. The crushing inflation that has occurred inside of Iran is certainly part of people's frustration with their own government. I don't know how many more sanctions can be levied against the Iranian state. It's pretty sanctioned already. I think that my feeling is that it's likely that the people of Iran will determine the fate of their country themselves at a very high price. And that, in a sense, what they're responding to is the way that the regime is perceived by the outside world is also how they themselves perceive it as an oppressive regime, and that they have tried to compromise and reform it without success. So I don't know that the sanctions or further sanctioning, I know that, you know, the IRGC was already sanctioned, now the morality police, but will that actually have any effect economically? I seriously doubt that will determine this regime staying or going. I think really it's about people's will to affect some fissures inside of the establishment. We've already seen a little bit of that, as Kamin Mohammadi said, but also I think if there begins to be more killing of girls, of children, which there already has been, as we know from the young women who've been killed already at the hands of security forces. If there continues to be that kind of response, I think it will really determine what happens in terms of any disagreements at the highest levels of this regime.
Okay, my final question to Kamin Mohammadi. We're running out of time on this program, but Kamin Mohammadi, if I were to ask you, what are you really hoping for will come out after these protests conclude? And the Iranian diaspora, how are they supporting the people on the ground? We're hearing about internet crackdowns as well. So at a time like this, people like you, how are you supporting the Iranian women and young students on the ground?
It's a really great question. Our hopes are, you know, the longer the protests go on, the more hope we have of some kind of lasting change. But I suppose in the first instance, while there is hope in seeing that people are taking some power and taking some space, and women particularly are saying no, enough. And that's unbelievably inspiring to see our people really lose the fear, you know, of the regime. But I suppose we all see lots of bloodshed ahead because we know how this regime is. What can we do in the diaspora? We can help to bring attention to, and we can help to amplify the voices that are actually coming out of Iran. I think it's really important for us not to impose our narrative and our desires onto what's going on there, but as best as we can support the people of Iran. And I think mostly what we can do is give them sort of moral support. You know, these hashtags are followed. Iranians are massively on social media, 80% of the population. Of course, we hear about internet going down. Yes, people are sending VPNs. They're sharing ways for people inside Iran to circumvent. So, you know, you need to also be careful, because at the same time, while the regime is blaming the West, of course, any involvement from the West is only going to make things more difficult for the people on the ground. So I just keep saying this to people. I know it feels really little, but keep on speaking about it, amplify the voices, let everybody know what's going on, you know, let the regime know that the world is watching, and let the people of Iran know that their bravery is not being ignored. It's not going unmarked. I think knowing that the world is supporting them, it's really important. They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones that are going to need the bravery, the stamina. I think the best that we can do is just keep drawing attention, you know, to their cause, to what is going on, and try to explain and contextualize it. This is what we're doing, right? We're trying, we're coming on programs like yours to try and give some, to flesh out really what's going on, because
we're running out of time.
You know, there's a lot that people don't know.
It was really beautiful talking to you. Yeah, it was beautiful talking to you and Persis, Karim. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but we'll keep this conversation here on Global Eye on CNBC-TV18, because this is a story that the world has been watching very closely, and our thoughts and prayers with the Iranian women and children on the ground there. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.